Dr. Roger Smith was Charles Manson's parole officer after Manson's release from prison in 1967. Smith was part of an experimental parole program called the San Francisco Project, which aimed to study the effects of varying caseloads on parole officers. Initially, Smith had a caseload of 40, but eventually Manson became his sole supervisee. Smith's role as Manson's parole officer allowed him to provide a degree of immunity to Manson and his followers. For example, in August 1968, Susan Atkins, one of Manson's followers, received a glowing reference from Smith, which helped her avoid a prison term. Smith's leniency and support for Manson and his followers have controversy and speculation. After being arrested a few times in a year, Roger Smith should have recommended parole revocation and sent Manson back to prison, but he never did. Instead, he wrote to his supervisors in Washington, D.C., and tried to get Manson to be allowed to go live in Mexico, where obviously he couldn't be supervised. They thought Roger was crazy. Tom McNeil, who has researched Manson for over 20 years, has the letters back and forth, basically saying, quote, "This man gives us no reason to think that he's not going to continue committing crimes without supervision. How can we do this to Mexico?" End quote. As previously mentioned, Roger Smith was part of the San Francisco Project. The San Francisco Project was an experimental parole program conducted from 1964 to 1967 by the University of California, Berkeley, in collaboration with U.S. Probation Office for the Northern District of California. The project aimed to study the effects of varying caseloads on parole officers and the outcomes for parolees. Key aspects of this program included: 1. Random assignment. Offenders were randomly assigned to different levels of supervision intensity, ranging from minimum to ideal to intensive. 2. Supervision intensity. The project assessed the performance of parolees under different supervision levels. 3. Pre-sentence recommendations. The study explored the factors influencing pre-sentence recommendations and court dispositions. 4. Violation rates. The project examined the relationship between the number of contacts between parole officers and parolees and the success or failure under supervision. The findings suggested that the level of supervision did not significantly impact the success rates of parolees, and the first 6 to 12 months of supervision were the most critical in terms of violation rates. The project suggests that intensive supervision did not necessarily lead to better outcomes compared to minimal supervision. Roger started with 40 cases, but in the end he was left with only Charles. Tom O'Neill, who researched Charles and his life, said of Roger Smith, quote, "By 1967, Smith was regarded as an expert of gangs, collective behavior, violence, and drugs. Manson, his one and only parolee supervisee, would go on to control the collective behavior of a gang through violence and drugs." End quote. Over time, Charles's followers grew in number, eventually leading to the 9 murders at 4 different locations in July and August 1969. Regarding Charles, Roger said, quote, "Charlie was the most hostile parolee I've ever come across. He was totally upfront about it. He told me right off there was no way he could keep the terms of his parole. He was headed back to the joint, and there was no way out of it." End quote. He added, quote, "In a sense, I think Charlie was really sort of shaken by it all, by the fact that people were friendly, open, and willing to do things with him. The first night he was in the Haight-Ashbury district, the chicks were willing to go to bed with him. They didn't care whether he had just gotten out of the joint. That was a real shocker for him." End quote. Regarding the parole system that Charles was a part of, Roger said that, quote, "There are a lot of Charlies running around, believe me. He's just one of several 100,000 people who are released from prison after a shattering, soul-rending experience, not prepared for anything except to go back on the streets and do more of the same, but bigger." End quote. In the 1960s, Roger was also a doctoral candidate at the University of California, Berkeley, with interests in criminology and the etiology of crime. For over 16 years, he served as the research director probation officer, and social worker for various public and private agencies in Illinois and the San Francisco Bay Area. Over the years, he has worked in several corrections departments specializing in treating SOs. Roger was the director of the Correctional Treatment Program at the Oregon Department of Mental Health for 9 years, until 1987. For 2 years, Roger served as the program specialist for the National Academy of Corrections and the U.S. Department of Justice in Boulder, Colorado. From 1990 to 2002, he held the position of the Director of SO Programs of the Department of Public Safety in Honolulu, Hawaii. Furthermore, Roger was the director of the Bureau of Forensic Mental Health Services in Michigan for a decade. Since 2002, the retired criminologist has worked as a consultant in matters of forensic and correctional mental health. Roger has worked in different states and currently lives in Redmond, Oregon. After working for Gottlieb at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas and the University of Oklahoma, Jolly West moved to San Francisco, where he met Roger Smith and David Smith, no relation to each other, and discovered their work at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. To fund its various LSD research programs in San Francisco, including a brothel, the CIA exploited several medical research organizations. A 1976 investigation by the New York Times revealed that the CIA had collaborated with the National Institute of Mental Health, the Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry, Inc., and the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research, using them as fronts to conceal its involvement. The CIA terminated MKUltra in 1973.